Okay, we are live. Tonight we're going to talk about kind of like the current state that I'm observing with presuppositionalism out in the internet community and debates. I think if you follow presuppositionalism, I think everyone's aware of the last debate that Sci10 had with Matt Delahunty, and also if you're on the Google Plus community, all the presuppositionalists that are on there. So I'm not going to give a introduction to presuppositionalism. I'm going to assume that most of the audience watching are somewhat familiar with it. But I'd like to start out talking about worldviews, because that always comes up in discussions with presuppositionalism. They always talk about the Christian worldview. Now, when you hear worldview, I really didn't even hear that term much until I started dealing with presuppositionalism. My understanding of a worldview is simply just your belief set. Everyone has beliefs, and worldview is how you view the world and your different beliefs about the world. So it's just your general belief set. Presuppositionalists get a little bit more defined in a world set. Greg Bahnsen, in some of his lectures, said this about worldview. So, worldview is a network of presuppositions which are not tested by natural science, in terms of which all experience is related and interpreted. A person's worldview is a network, first of all. It's not just one belief, it's a whole system of beliefs. The kind of beliefs we're dealing with when we're talking about worldview are the special variety of belief called presuppositions. He goes on to say it's a very fundamental and logically basic assumption. So again, according to Greg Bahnsen, was a leader in presuppositionalism, he defines a worldview as a network of presuppositions which are basically very foundational, fundamental assumptions of your beliefs. And with that, there's different ways in a debate with presuppositionalism, and when a presuppositionalist debates a non-Christian, they'll bring up something called an internal critique and versus an external critique of a worldview. I guess an internal critique would be you're basically looking at the beliefs within the worldview and looking for some sort of inconsistency or incompleteness in the worldview. So I guess an example is if you wanted to critique like the Star Wars movies, you could bring up some sort of contradiction within the Star Wars movies. For example, in episode 6, I believe, Luke asks Leia, what did she know about her biological mother? And Princess Leia says, "Oh, I remember just very little bit about her. She was very pretty, but she was sad." But in episode 3, we learn that Padme dies right after childbirth, giving birth to Luke and Leia. So there's some sort of internal inconsistency in the Star Wars movies, and I'm sure some sort of Star Wars apologist probably has some solutions to deal with that predicament. I guess an external critique of a worldview is using facts outside of that belief set to critique a worldview. For example, perhaps a naturalist would critique a supernaturalist because a naturalist doesn't believe in anything supernatural, something like that. That would be a very bad argument, but I guess that would be considered an external critique. One thing I've noticed with the cyclones, with Psi and other cyclones, is when they critique other worldviews, it doesn't seem like they're really doing much of an internal critique. It seems like they're attacking the presuppositions right away. And I'm not sure if that would be considered an external critique or not. Like in the debate we saw with Sy versus Matt Dillahunty, Sy brought up the problem of solipsism, where epistemic solipsism, all you can really know is your mind, and everything else you experience could simply be in your mind, and you really can't justify what you experience is really part of the external world. It's kind of like a properly basic belief, so to speak, that there is a mind-independent reality. And since it is a properly basic belief, a presupposition, it's not something that you can really justify. And the cyclones seem to just be saying, you can't justify your presuppositions, therefore your worldview is irrational. And it seems like, well, they have presuppositions, and if they can't justify them, then they're equally irrational. So it seems like a double standard is going on. Does anyone else see that going on?
I have. The way an internal critique is supposed to work is you're supposed to start from the assumptions of the person's worldview. So, I mean, a presuppositionalist should not challenge the presuppositions of a person's worldview. They're supposed to demonstrate the inadequacy of the worldview on the assumption that their presuppositions are correct. You're supposed to not challenge the veracity of the presuppositions. You're supposed to accept them provisionally for the purposes of internal critique, and then work out the implications and show that this leads to an inadequacy. You're not supposed to say, oh, you can't defend your presuppositions. I mean, a presuppositionalist should be the first person to say presuppositions, qua presuppositions, aren't defended. They are the stuff out of which everything else follows, but they are themselves not founded on anything else, and consequently, you just start with them, and then you work out the deductive consequences or the implications of that person's worldview. And so you start with that. Unfortunately, what's happened is there seems to have been a kind of a weird oversimplification where people have heard that as a presuppositionalist, you're never supposed to step out of your worldview. You are never supposed to forsake or abandon your worldview. But they have construed this in the wrong way. Some of them seem to have construed this as, I'm never, even for the purposes of argument, that is arguendo, I'm not even for the purposes of argument going to forsake my presuppositions and accept yours. Well, how do you do an internal critique? Unless you say, I'm going to bracket my presuppositions, for the sake of argument, I'm going to pretend to take on yours, and we're going to examine what follows from that, right? But there's this tension. Some presuppositionists have gotten a little confused. They've heard this idea that you're not supposed to abandon your presuppositions. And what that really means is you're not supposed to abandon your presuppositions when you're putting forth your case. It's not that you're not supposed to bracket it when you're evaluating the other person's worldview. And so you've got these people who are a little confused about what they're supposed to be doing when they are doing an internal critique. What you're supposed to do when you're doing an internal critique is bracket your own presuppositions, assume the presuppositions of the view that you are critiquing, work out the implications that you can, find therein a contradiction, an inconsistency, or some kind of inadequacy, an incompleteness that is inconsistent with whatever else another person believes or assumes to be true, and then you have exposed some kind of failure within that worldview, an inadequacy or an incompleteness at a minimum, or a complete contradiction or inconsistency at worst. And that's how an internal critique is supposed to go. And so, yeah, I am seeing the kind of problem that you're describing there.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like the cyclone version of presuppositions, they're simply saying, you can't justify your presuppositions. Ah ha 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 ha. Well, if you listen to some of Greg Bahnsen's debates, I mean, he says that presuppositions are not justified; they're taken by faith. So it's a double standard for a cyclone to say, you can't justify your presuppositions while I can justify solipsism because my God exists. He created the external world. He created us in our own image and so forth. Well, they're just saying solipsism is false because my religion says it's false. Well, great. Well, we have a presupposition that says there's a mind-independent reality as well. So, you know, it's not really a real honest criticism at all. It just seems to, they're just taking advantage that we're all fallible beings, that we're not all knowing, near they, but they just want to, I guess, abuse the non-Christian that we have beliefs that are not justified, that you know, they're presuppositions, that they're not justified.
This brings me to an excellent point. There's a word that should be brought up in this conversation. It's called Fideism. Fideism is this view that faith is something taken, if not a contrary to reason. That's the most extreme version of Fideism. It's something that says that Fideism is apart from human reason, something that God just gives you. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Fideism. I'll stick to Fideism on pain of being wrong. But there's this beautiful quote by Norman Geisler who also characterizes presuppositionalism under this rubric, because presuppositionalism is based on this notion that human reason is incapable of doing anything on its own. Fideism, according to Ozzy. Thank you. Which sees that human reasoning capabilities are fallen. And Norman Geisler, who himself is a classical apologist, actually makes this brilliant point. Fideists do not differentiate clearly between the basis of belief in God and the support or warrant for that belief. Evidence may be used to support, confirm, or even accompany this belief, but it must never be the basis for believing. The Fideists properly stressed the basis for belief, namely God or his revelation, but they seem to neglect entirely the warrant or support for exercising this belief. In short, evidence bears directly on that belief that there is a God, but not directly on the belief in God. Belief that is an intellectual matter, and there are rational arguments for it. Belief in is an existential concern that has no such objective test for truth. Fideism is right on the latter, but mostly completely overlooks the need for a criteria or test on the truth that there is a God, or that the Bible is the Word of God, and so on. Fideists fail to understand the implication of the difference between the unavoidability of and the justifiability of presuppositions. We may grant that presuppositions are unavoidable. Men cannot think without epistemological and even ontological assumptions. However, the crucial question is not whether we can avoid using presuppositions, but whether we can justify those we use, which presuppositions should be chosen, and with what warrant. Can some belief be eliminated as false and others be established true? If so, by what method or test of truth? Fideists do not face these questions squarely, or if they do, they tend to provide non-fideistic answers, such as to believe otherwise is contrary to one's experience to reason, to his hope for the future, or to bring undesired results. But to answer this way is to return to rationalism, or move on to experientialism, or pregnantist, or test for truth. This is no longer methodological fideism. So on one hand, the presuppositionalist says human reason is just unintelligible and improper for understanding this stuff, but they give reason specifically and thus step back out of this presuppositionalism. So they kind of do this hokey pokey where they tell you one thing but practice another things, stepping into the conversation when need be and thus editing themselves out when they need to use this double standard.
Nadia, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yes, I believe there's also an analogy with divine command theory, where they claim their presuppositions are privileged or superior because of their, being attributed to their deity and so on. God has revealed it to me in such a way that I know it to be true, right? So from there, the privilege, or rather the argument that it's privileged, therefore, is not really made. It's just kind of assumed, and they don't have well, I don't believe very good answers to that. and in like fashion, divine command theory suffers similarly. So.
Yeah. I noticed. I think pretty much all presuppositionalists, Christian presuppositionalists, are also inerrantists. You know, they believe in the inerrant, that the Bible's inerrant. So when you try to offer an internal critique by bringing up contradictions in the Bible, they pretty much want to shut that conversation down right away. I think a common response from their script, from the Cyclones, is to basically say, well, that's an interesting question. That would be a good question to talk about in a Bible study, but unfortunately, I only have Bible studies with other Christians, and I don't have that with atheists. So basically, they just want to shut down any internal critique that you want to offer. Actually, I remember a couple of years ago, I was debating a presuppositionalist, and he said that I could not offer any internal critique because his worldview said that since I'm totally depraved and can't reason properly, that I can't even, I'm not even in a position to offer an internal critique. So, and my response to that is, I'll assume all your presuppositions. I'll even grant your whole entire worldview. I'll accept, for example, I'll accept your justification for logic. I'll assume that your God created logic, and therefore that's why we're justified to use logic, and I'll still use that to critique your worldview. Because it doesn't matter. If you still have a contradiction in your worldview, it doesn't matter if your God justifies logic or not. You still have a contradiction, but he still wouldn't have that. It was obviously very frustrating when you debate a presuppositionalist.
Just as a point of clarification, presuppositionalism does not necessarily entail biblical inerrancy, but it does heavily accompany it. But it's not even inerrancy. Inerrancy just means the Bible is right. However, they're literalists. An inerrantist might say, look, a lot of the Bible you just have to understand maybe through its genre. You have to understand that some things are just metaphors and some things are just meant for that. So a biblical literalist will say, no, it's all literally true. You read it in a common sense approach, face value. So they tend to be far more extreme than just inerrancy.
Yeah. I guess another common thing that comes up is usually knowledge. What's the definition of knowledge? They always go with the justified true belief definition of knowledge, which is a definition of knowledge. It's not considered a bad definition, but there are other definitions. And another double standard that I see is that they often use an externalist justification for their beliefs, while they require an internalist justification for their opponents. So I wonder if we could talk about the difference between an externalist epistemological justification versus an internalist. And Ozzy, do you think you could add some insight into that?
Yeah, sure. My background was actually in this when I was a grad student. First thing to say about that is that in philosophy, in epistemology specifically, which is that branch of philosophy that concerns itself with questions of knowledge and justification and science and how we know things, in epistemology we have competing definitions of knowledge. One of the definitions that gets used and discussed an awful lot is the justified true belief definition of knowledge. The reason it's discussed so widely is because it sort of sits well with our intuitions, and it's the earliest definition of knowledge ever put on offer. It was first sort of put forth by Plato in a dialogue called the Theaetetus. What it says is that there are three components, three ingredients in knowledge. First, in order to know something, you have to have a belief. You have to believe a proposition, call it P. And that belief has to be true. That is the object of the belief. It must in fact be the case. Okay, so that's the truth condition. So there's a belief condition and a truth condition. But of course, you can have a belief and it could turn out to be true, but if it's just lucky, if you're sort of using a magic 8-ball or something like that, or you're rolling dice to sort of predict the weather or decide what to wear that day and stuff like that, your beliefs might not be connected to the facts in any way. They might be arbitrarily or just by luck, right or wrong. And a belief that just happens to be right is sometimes called a right opinion. It's just luck. A true belief all by itself isn't knowledge. A belief has to be justified, is the view here, and it has to be justified in the sense that the belief somehow has to be caused by or occasioned, connected in some way to the facts. And so if there's something that connects the belief to the fact of the belief, the fact to which the belief refers, then the belief is justified. So that's the justified true belief definition of knowledge. That is not a theory of knowledge, by the way. That's a definition of knowledge. It's a provisional definition. It's a first approximation, and there are all kinds of problems with it. Like Gettier cases, for instance, are real counterexamples to this. But nevertheless, it's still a good sort of first approximation as a definition of knowledge. But when you are trying to work out a complete theory of knowledge, you have to explain what all of these terms mean. You have to explain, well, what does the word truth mean? So you have to have a definition and an account of truth. You have to have a definition and an account of what a belief is. And of course, the hardest part in all this actually is having a definition and an account of justification. What constitutes justification? And theories of epistemic justification, of what connects your belief to the facts, such that your belief amounts to knowledge, all of those theories of justification can be broken down broadly into two categories, two very general categories: internalist theories of justification and externalist theories of justification. And there's all kinds of theories, but they break down into these two camps, externalist and internalist. So let me explain what an internalist one is first. An internalist conception of justification is a theory of justification that imagines that in order to be justified, in order to have a belief that's justified, the agent, the person having the belief, the cognitive agent, has to be able to be aware of what his or her reasons are. So, if I say, I know I'm looking at a laptop right now. Well, how do I know I'm looking at my laptop? Well, I'm having a visual experience. Okay, I'm aware of the visual experience, and I can tell you what it is. And sometimes we have beliefs about, what we did yesterday. Well, how do you know what you did yesterday? Well, I have a memory. I have this experience, right? And when you ask a person, why do you believe such and such a thing? What are you doing but asking them, what are your reasons? And you're expecting the person to be able to bring forth, to put forth their reasons, their evidence, right? Usually in the form of experiences that they've had, observational experiences, memories, things that they've read, whatever. It can either be direct experience or indirect, but the point is they have to be able to express, put forward, summon up, at least in principle, if not in the immediate moment, at least in principle, the justification must be available to the consciousness of the agent. It has to be something that they can be literally consciously aware of, at least in principle, if not moment by moment. Okay? So for instance, if you ask me, what's the capital of Spain, I might not be able to think of it right now. But I do know the capital of Spain. It just escapes me right now. But if I think about it, it'll come to my mind. And so it would make sense to say that Ozzy knows the capital of Spain, even though in this particular instance, it's escaped me. Okay, I could summon it up if I thought about it. I'd have to remind myself, try to remind myself of some cities in Spain and go, oh right, it's that one. So that's an internalist conception of justification. It has to be the case that at least in principle you can summon forth and make available to your consciousness the justification, the reasons, the evidence that you have. There is a difficulty with this view, though, and that is that if it is a condition on knowledge that you be able to give the reasons, and that's always the case, then this sets up an infinite regress. Because if in order to know a proposition P, I have to know another proposition, call it Q. If I have to know Q in order to know P, then in order to know Q, I have to have a reason for knowing Q. So in order to know P, I have to know that Q is true. So I'll have to give a reason for Q. Oh, well, what's that reason going to be? Well, that's going to be another experience I bring to consciousness. That's going to be R. And so in order to know that P is true, I have to know that Q is true. In order to know that Q is true, I'm going to have to know that R is true. In order to know R is true, S is true. And you see where this goes. It generates an infinite justificatory regress. In order to know a proposition, you have to know the reasons for your reasons, for your reasons, for your reasons. Now, this assumption that in order to know something, it means that you have to know that you know it. That's called the KK principle. It is a debated principle. Most epistemologists, I think, these days think it's kind of hokey, that it's based on a very faulty intuition that we have. But nevertheless, the internalist conception of justification is typically coupled with the intuition that you always have to be able to give reasons. To know something is to know that you know it. You can't just know a proposition. You have to know that you know it in order to know it. There's no such thing as just a direct first-order knowledge. There's always meta-knowledge required to have first-order knowledge, or second-order knowledge to have first-order knowledge, third-order knowledge required to have second-order knowledge, and so forth. That's called the KK principle. And it's called KK because it stands for know that you know, K for K. You have to know that you know in order to know something. So that's internalism. And so some epistemologists, for a long, long time now, centuries, have said, there's something wrong with this whole conception. This is a conception very well articulated by Descartes. And they thought, something's messed up with this. I mean, first of all, it engenders an infinite justificatory regress. And if you look at how people proceed, they don't, in fact, go on infinitely giving reasons. And yet we countenance that certain things constitute knowledge. So it's got to be that we don't actually believe in the KK principle. Something's got to give here. Something's wrong with this internalist conception of justification, even though it's fairly intuitive. So what else could be going on? What's another conception? And the other conception is called externalism. An externalist conception of justification is one where the agent does not have to have in his or her awareness reasons or evidence available to them. It's not that there are no reasons and that there is no evidence. It's that they don't necessarily have to be conscious of them. They might be conscious of them, as we sometimes are, but sometimes we're not conscious of the reasons. We're not aware. We can't summon them up. For instance, sometimes I will recognize a person and I can't remember where I recognize them from. I recognize them, though. I know I've seen this face, but I don't know where I've seen this face. Okay? Now, you have a reason why. There is a reason, rather, why you recognize this person, but you can't summon up the reason. Okay? And you might never be able to recover the memory of where you saw this person. It could be gone. And yet, you are justified in thinking that you've seen this person. You're justified in the sense, you're not subjectively justified, you're justified in an objective sense, in that there was a cause for your recollection, your recognition. So an externalist conception of justification is essentially a kind of causal account. The idea is that if there are causal circumstances that cause you to have a certain belief, okay, if your belief literally is the result of a causal chain that goes all the way back to the object of your belief, then you know what you think you know. So if, for instance, you're looking at an object, I'm looking at a coffee mug right now. What's happening is this. There is, in fact, a coffee mug here. There's light bouncing off of it and hitting me in my eyes. I have a visual system capable of systematically co-varying with changing optical circumstances around me, such that the visual experience that I'm having right now is literally the product caused by the fact that there's a mug here. If there wasn't a mug here, I wouldn't be having a visual experience of the mug. Okay. Now you can say, well, yeah, but couldn't there be some other circumstance where you're hallucinating? Yes, that too would be possible. But in that circumstance, notice there is no mug. So in that circumstance, the person isn't in possession of knowledge because there is in fact no connection. So the idea is not that the agent has to know that there is a connection. There just has to be a connection. There just have to be external circumstances that occasion or cause your belief. And so an externalist conception of justification is one where there is something outside of the agent that is responsible, causally usually, for the person having the beliefs that they do. And if those conditions abide, and when those conditions abide, then we know what we think we know. The problem is we don't know if and when those circumstances hold, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're an internalist or an externalist. You're never able to establish that the experiences that you're having are veridical and that you're not dreaming. Everyone is sort of stuck in this problem. But at least on the externalist conception of justification, you have an account of what it means to have knowledge, even though there are circumstances where you won't be able to establish that you know. But according to the externalist, you don't need to know that you know. It rejects the KK principle. The KK principle, it is argued, is simply unwarranted. There is simply no reason to insist that in order to know something, you have to know that you know it, that you know it, that you know it, that you know it infinitely. What reason is there for thinking that? We don't proceed that way, so it seems like a rather gratuitous intuition. And so the externalist just posits that so long as there are external circumstances that cause and occasion your beliefs, then under those circumstances, when those circumstances abide, you know what you think you know, whether or not you're aware of the causal story. You don't have to be aware of the causal story. But it's great when you do, because then when you can tell what the causal story is, you can in fact discharge your burden of justification to another person. You can explain to another person how you know what you think you know. So that's the difference. I hope that was enough to clear it up.
Yeah, thanks. And that leads to the question, are presuppositionalists internalists or externalists, and what do they require from non-Christians? From what I've seen, I think some presuppositionalists, I think some will even claim to be externalists. And I have a quote from John Frame. John Frame is a Calvinist theologian and a presuppositionalist. He has a paper online called Presuppositional Apologetics, an Introduction, Part 1. If you Google it, it is available online. And talking about how God gives them the ability to know things, he openly says, and I quote, "Mysterious though the process may be, somehow God illumes the human mind to discern the divine source of the word. We know without knowing how we know." And that sounds very much like an externalist.
It is.
Yeah.
Could I jump in again?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Presuppositionalists are externalists. What they posit is that there is a God, and that God is that which connects you to the facts. Right? God created the facts, and He created you in such a way that you're causally connected, physically connected to the world. You're integrated into the world. You're sort of, plugged into the world in such a way that your eyes respond to things going on around you. Your ears respond to things going on around you. And so God is able to create you and a world in such a way that your experiences systematically covary with changing states around you. And so that's fine, but that's an externalist conception of justification. God is one of the things one of the things in the causal story that connects you to how you know that you're looking at a coffee mug, or how you remember a picnic that you went on last year, or something like that. What's interesting in this discourse, though, is that a lot of presuppositionalists have taken up presuppositionalism without knowing much of the philosophical background to it, and they don't understand the distinction between internalism and externalism. And they don't realize that presuppositionalism is supposed to, in fact, be an externalist conception of justification, that it, in fact, employs an externalist conception of justification, which, by the way, I think is a very good conception of justification. I think the internalist conception is just hopeless myself, but and so it stood to their credit that they use an externalist conception of justification. But because most people are not versed in this epistemological jargon, they don't know that this is what's going on. And when they sort of ply the kind of cyclone script, they're used to asking people, how do you know that, how do you know that? And what they're doing there is they're insisting that the other person play by the rules of internalism, that the other person has a responsibility to be always endlessly be able to give reasons, and if they can't satisfy that condition, then they don't know what they think they know. But that is that is not the presuppositionalist view of justification. It's perfectly all right if you're talking to an internalist to point out this problem. And a lot of people are sort of naive internalists, because when you're asked for justification, you give justification. And if a person doesn't buy your justification, you have to give reasons to convince them why they should buy your justification. And so you end up giving reasons for your reasons, and that can go on for a long time. And so that's what fuels the intuition that internalism should be right, should be the right conception. It's the fact that we're sometimes called upon to give reasons for our reasons for our reasons. But when you're arguing with a cyclone, they're really and I think they come by this honestly. They don't realize that they're making this mistake. They don't realize that they're playing by a double standard. That they are themselves exploiting an externalist conception of justification, while insisting that everybody else that they're talking to be limited to an internalist conception of justification. When in fact, if they were to ask me or ask any externalist who doesn't believe in God, the externalist could say, well, no, I've posited a mind-independent reality, and this mind-independent reality, because it exists and has certain properties, impinges on me and my sensory surfaces in all sorts of ways. And my brain is an evolved and adapted engine that allows me to have mental states that systematically covary with changing circumstances around me, and thus my beliefs are occasioned under normal circumstances, are caused by actual states of affairs, and this is why I can trust my senses, and why I can trust my memory, and why I can rely on the inferential practices that I do that have proven themselves effective. And so you don't have to be a believer in a God to posit externalism. I mean, most externalists out there don't believe in a God who are philosophers. They just, they believe in externalism because they think it's a better conception of justification. But unfortunately, the cyclones, I think, typically are not very well versed in this jargon, and don't even realize that they're playing by a double standard, that they're playing a kind of bait and switch.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ned. Yeah.
No, Isaiah, what I was going to say is from my experience, I definitely want to mirror everything you just said there, and even take it a couple of steps farther. And they don't understand the difference in the different schools of thought of presuppositionalism as it was first. I guess the big division where Clark came in, and the history of presuppositionalism, which really, in my opinion, hamstrings them not only from a philosophical standpoint, but even understanding what the main premise and the whole purpose for presuppositionalism was in the first place. But to kind of take a step back and talk about the externalist versus the internal approach, one thing that I like to do, and it seems I really want to try to expand on this a little bit, because I haven't been very successful in actually getting anyone to address it. But as Floyd mentioned earlier, one of the ways that I think is most advantageous in this is to actually grant them as much as you possibly can, and springboard from that. And one of the things that I've really been trying to work with lately is saying that, look, I will grant the justification for my understanding and knowledge is your God. And now that we have established that I can reason and I do have access to knowledge, we should be able to move past that point, and now let's actually address the points that I'm bringing up. When I've done that, the interesting thing that I've found is that they won't let you. Is anybody else finding that, or has anybody else even tried something like that before?
Negation of P. I could probably answer why they tend to not go in that direction with you. A lot of presuppositionalists come from, as I said earlier, a very Calvinistic theological background, which places huge emphasis on human depravity and human inability to come to God or want to understand God. They don't even think the human intellect is capable of it. Even though you're granting them all this on an intellectual standpoint, they still believe you have a reprobate mind that isn't really in tune with the facts that you say or even consciously assume that you're agreeing to. So I think So even though you might get the presuppositionalists on an intellectual level, they always have their theological hinting to support their viewpoint, or even to make sure they can be very distrustful of you, even if you are willing to grant them that.
Sorry, I was muted.
I run into.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. No, I was just going to say thanks.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I run into a trap where, well, in say the argument from heterologics and so on, or counter argument from it, the essentially one abandons absolute certainty and so on, and that's where they come in. Essentially, when things are not asserted to be absolutely certain, they say that, well, you don't truly know it at all. And that's kind of a different angle, but still, when it's kind of something that's refused to be granted, that's a similar phenomenon.
Yeah, when we hear from the cyclones, they'll say, it's been revealed to me, what's they're saying? It's been revealed to me in a way that I can know that it's certain. That's the way they phrase it.
Yeah, usually it's been revealed to me in such a way that I can be certain.
Yeah, so a question is, are they thinking that's an internalist or an externalist? Because they're claiming they know.
Well, what they're positing there, I think, that is internalist. What they're positing is, no sort of philosophically informed presuppositionalist is going to say those words like that. I mean, that doesn't make sense. That's confusing two things. It's confusing sort of the idea of the self-authenticating testimony of the Holy Spirit with conditions for knowledge in general. One can imagine that a God who is omnipotent could, if he wanted to, zap a belief into your head such that you were incapable of doubting it, even if it were false. I mean, a being could, in principle, do that. I mean, if we had a sufficient understanding of neurophysiology, we could do that. We could sort of tinker in somebody's brain and make them have a belief and be so filled with confidence that they were literally, psychologically incapable of doubting it. Right? But indubitability doesn't imply inerrancy. But it's entirely possible that a God, if one exists and is omnipotent, could make a person believe something, true or false. Let's get at, for the sake of the argument, that it's true. Believe something with absolute conviction that is in fact true, and hence the person would genuinely be incapable of doubting it. Okay. That is to say, by hypothesis, no evidence that you could offer, no counter argument could ever talk them out of it. Now, the difficulty, though, is that a belief that is self-authenticating is a bit of a problem. How can a belief be self-authenticating? How can a mental experience be one that's not subject to doubt, right? Well, it's not all kinds of things are not subject to doubt within the scope of certain assumptions, right? But how can a belief like, this is a coffee mug, for instance, how could I have an experience there that's not subject to doubt? Of course I could doubt it. In principle, under the right circumstances, I could doubt it. And so when people posit that God has revealed something to them in such a way that that they can be certain, that is really just a boast, right? Because they're not themselves able to do this. And if they were to apply the internalism that they insist we abide by, you'd be able to say, how do you know that this belief that you have is a belief that you cannot doubt? Because you're not doubting it right now, right? You don't know that you couldn't doubt it. You could doubt it tomorrow. Right? You could doubt it in 5 minutes. And so you could play the same game with them if they want to stick to a kind of internalism. But what they think they've done is they've defined that by simply stating that there is a belief that cannot be doubted, that gets them out of the regress. But of course it doesn't. It beggars the very same challenge that they're putting to everybody else.
Here's another problem with that position as well. What they're doing, they're explaining how is it they know, which is very, it would describe the mechanisms. God is manipulating you in a way, or revealing something to you in a way that you're aware of it, whether or not it's true or false. However, it's not a reason as to why you know that. So it doesn't give, so why is more like a state of intentionality. You're giving a reason as to why you believe something, from either prior beliefs or beliefs that are properly basic, or beliefs that we take on face value because if we were to reject them, it would lead us into absurdity or something along these lines.
But I also see a third problem, which is actually the tack that I like to take more than actually confronting them on making them justify that statement, is, again, grant them that statement and then ask them how do they know that their quote-unquote divine knowledge is not a lie. We have dozens of examples of God lying in the Bible, and in my opinion, the most powerful one is in Exodus, where God deceives Pharaoh, hardens his heart. So even if you grant that, yes, God does have access to that, he can put things into your mind, there would be no way for you to determine that what he's telling you now is not part of his plan, and part of that, and in that plan, it was to deceive you with all of everything that you're believing at this point, just like he did with Pharaoh.
Right. So he could be sending a lying spirit, which he has done to prophets, and also a strong delusion to people, which is stated in 1 Timothy. So the issue is not really where or in whom the belief originates. The problem is who's having the belief, and that's us. Us humans who are fallible beings. So we could and you're talking about if a God's inserting thoughts in your head, how can the agent, the subject, know that it is actually true? If it's just blindly inserted, well, a person could be a schizophrenic and believe that those beliefs are true, and it sounds like a very bad epistemological method, because you're just, it's like those thoughts are just popping in your head, and you're not thinking about whether they're actually true, or are they valid, or do they correspond with your other beliefs or not. They're just popping in your head. It kind of leads to how presuppositionists define truth. I heard them say, and I heard Greg Bonson actually said it as well, that their definition of truth is what conforms to the mind of God. I think that's how Greg Bonson defines it. So, if you do have an all-knowing God, that God would have the best perspective of the truth. So, if you're trying to figure out who killed JFK, was there a shot from the grassy knoll? Was there a second assassin? Was it Lee Harvey Oswald from the book repository building? God, being all-knowing, from his all-knowing perspective, he would know exactly who killed JFK. Where us fallible human beings, people believe there's someone at the grassy knoll. It could have been an echo from Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle that bounced off of it. But how does that how in the presuppositionalist view, how does that give the presuppositionalist actual truth and knowledge? Is God whispering in their ears that yes, it was just Lee Harvey Oswald, or yes, there was someone at a grassy knoll? I think it's a non sequitur. I think you can say God created us with a mind. This God wants us to know things, but and perhaps he created us with, most of us, with reliable minds, but from there we're still kind of on our own. We're still obtaining knowledge from our limited view. So I'm not sure how how saying truth is what conforms to God. Perhaps that could be true because God is all-knowing, and he would certainly know what's true or false. But I'm not sure how that really works as an epistemological method. Does that seem to make sense?
Here's the biggest problem I find with that. If you say that knowledge A comes from God and B corresponds to what's in God's mind, then you, in point of fact, make God a deceiver because he is selectively picking and choosing who at each time gets what piece of knowledge or lack thereof. So, in a sense, everything you do is not a work of your own thought or rationality or even ability given to God. Rather, it's something God completely picks and chooses at each point of time, or at each point of creation. So nobody is justifying their own beliefs, but rather it's God doing all the quote unquote justifying, which kind of goes back to bite the whole reliance on true justified belief to begin with.
Could I interject with a couple of things? Floyd, you mentioned, I think it was 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy in connection with the passage about God setting strong delusion. If I'm not mistaken, that's actually from 2 Thessalonians, not Timothy.
Oh yes, you're probably right. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think you just misspoke there, but just for anyone listening, it's in 2 Thessalonians. And the other thing is, what you and Epi are saying about sort of a definition of truth in terms of conformity with God's mind. I mean, if God knows all the facts, then you could do no better than to know God's mind on any fact, and then you'd be in possession of the facts. But the question, the epistemological question, is how are these facts delivered to us? And I mean, according to presuppositionalism, God is not zapping knowledge into our heads miraculously. That's not what he's doing. The whole point of the presuppositionalist apologetic and the argument from knowledge is that God is the critical ingredient in our capacity to have knowledge, because God created us, and he created the world, and he created us for the world, and the world for us, such that we would have brains with reliable belief-forming systems like vision and tactile senses and hearing and stuff like that, and a memory. And he created an ordered reality over time so that we could make predictions and we could trust our inferential practices and stuff like that. So the idea is that not that God is doing anything supernatural in providing us with knowledge. God has simply created a world where knowledge is possible by perfectly ordinary, mundane means. Right? He can zap knowledge into people's heads, but that's not how people know things. The way you know that there's a coffee mug in front of you is not because God has done anything to make that knowledge appear in your head, because what that would mean is, as Effie said, God would be lying to you. Every time someone has a mistaken belief, God is somehow deluding them. Every time someone is subject to a systematic illusion, God would be deluding them. No, God is not responsible for you having your beliefs moment by moment. God has created a world in which you can have true beliefs and you can have false beliefs. But God is not busily putting beliefs into your head, and that's why presuppositionalism, properly construed, does not posit that your knowledge is coming directly from God, but rather that God is a permissive condition for the possibility of knowledge, also the possibility of error. And that's what the argument should be. But what happens is a lot of these cyclones specifically, when they're arguing with someone, they keep saying, how do you know that, how do you know that, how do you know that? And as soon as someone turns the argument around on them, then they have a tendency to wet themselves because they don't know how to get out of that argument. So they say, oh, well, God just, he revealed it to me in a way that I can be certain, right? Well, wait a minute, that's not even part of presuppositionalism. Yes, there's this idea of a self-authenticating witness and testimony of the Holy Spirit, But that's not how you know that there's a chocolate bar in front of you or a coffee mug in front of you. The Holy Spirit's not doing that to you moment by moment. And so they're just sort of picking and choosing little bits of dogma and confecting an epistemology. And this has sort of been widely repeated. And because it has the character of a script, where there are moves that you make to stump the other person, as soon as a person tries to stump you back, you have to have something to try to block that. And one of these lines is, "It's been revealed to me in such a way that I can be certain." I literally heard in a hangout a presuppositionalist arguing that he didn't know how God created cows, but he knew that God created cows, specifically the cows that we have in our fields. And someone quickly pointed out, you realize that God didn't create cows, right? You realize that God, if he created anything, created the wild aurochs, from which we domesticated through husbandry, domesticated cows, and that the wild auroch species is gone. But you just went and said that God, that you can be certain and you couldn't be wrong about your belief that you know God created cows, because God sort of is magicking this knowledge into your head. And so they have, I think, in a way, they're sort of, I mean, this is a kind of blasphemy, right? I mean, this is a really sacrilegious thing to say, because every time they're wrong about something, that error has to be put at God's doorstep. If the kind of lunkheaded epistemology that they're putting forward is actually what presuppositionalism and Christianity teaches. So there are some unfortunate effects of this kind of dumbed-down version of presuppositionalism.
And just to throw in there, that's the main reason I, as a Christian, kind of go against it. Well, at least one of the reasons. I also view it as intellectually dishonest, but just throwing that up.
Yeah. So the argument that they use quite often is, they ask, are you using your reason to justify your reasoning? As a properly basic belief, you can't justify it, because of course, to think at all, to reason at all, you have to use your reasoning. There's no way out of it. But their worldview really doesn't get them out of that as well, because as you said, Ozzy, a God could have created their brains and so forth, but in their worldview as well, they have, schizophrenics, people exist, people with brain damage, all sorts of psychosis and so forth. People who cannot reason well do exist. So, so if you pose a question to them, they can say, "Oh, well, my God created me in such a way where I have the ability to reason and so forth." But you could still be one of those people who are mentally impaired, who can't reason correctly. And how would they know? Are they going to use their reasoning to determine whether they can reason okay? So depositing a God really doesn't solve the problem for them, either. It's still an issue. So it is kind of naive.
Well, personally, I think it makes the problem even worse, because if, as they claim, their God is, all powerful, all knowing, timeless, all of that type of thing, what that throws into the mix is everything becomes subjective to God's will, which means you can't know anything, because at the drop of a hat, God could change everything, including the laws of physics and logic, and anything across the board, including their own existence. So when they want to take that step to say, we have objective truths, we have objective morality, well, not if it's changeable in the way that God can do it according to their scripture, which opens an entire new can of worms.
Just to point something out here, when it comes to understanding God's relationship to logic and morality, these are some things that theists, we ourselves as theists, disagree with in terms of how to relate it to God. For example, in terms of morality, I actually don't ground it in divine command or God's commandments. I ground morality in human nature. So there are various positions theists can take, and some theists don't even. The notion that God can control the laws of logic is a very minority viewpoint, just to say. Although you do have a point in terms of the laws of physics.
Nada, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Well, they have some amount of arbitrariness also in terms of essentially what their reasoning implies. Like, well, number one, say theory of justification. Number two, which particular logic. Number three, well, just they have a whole bunch of arbitrary things floating around in there that you know, by divine fiat could be different from what they say. So when they say that, say it's a precondition for intelligibility that that Aristotelian logic be held, and that the deity could switch it over to, say, a paraconsistent or a fuzzy logic tomorrow. I think they're in a bit of trouble. And their own preconditions for intelligibility are at the whim of the divine dictator. So.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as a Christian perspective, presuppositionists claim that presuppositionalism is more biblical because it denies the autonomy of the self, they call it, where you're relying on your own reasoning to determine things rather than the sovereignty of God, of relying on God. You hear stuff in the Bible like, lean not on your own understanding, and so forth. But I like to note that not all Reformed theologians, not all Calvinist theologians are presuppositionalists, or think presuppositionalist is the only method that should be used. One example is Calvinist theologian R.C. Sproul. He uses classical apologetics, and he brings up the case that you don't have to start with God, or in fact you can't start with God. He claims you're not relying on the autonomy of God, and you're not using the autonomy of self, but rather you're starting with the consciousness of the self, that we start with our own self-consciousness. So when we reason, we can't reason with God's brain, or we can't reason with someone else's brain. We can only reason with our own brain. So we don't start with the autonomy of the self, rather we start with the consciousness of the self. And with self-consciousness, you have the awareness of finitude, that you're aware of yourself. It makes you aware that you're not God, that you're not all-knowing and not all-powerful. So the idea of autonomy of self is not contained in the idea of self-consciousness. So that's his view, and he also points out the basic problems of presuppositionalism, such as circular reasoning and equivocation. So I guess that's just a word out to Calvinists, that not all Calvinists are presuppositionalists.
Floyd, can I make a distinction that R.C. Sproul makes between classical apologetics and what Cyclones deem to be evidential apologetics?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Presuppositionalists tend to equivocate classical apologetics with evidentials. There's a clear distinction. A classical apologist would be someone who not only gives evidence that the resurrection happened, or that the Christian faith has a good justification for it being true, but also that God exists, and they'll do it with classical natural theological arguments like the cosmological argument, an ontological argument. There are various arguments. However, an evidentialist is someone who just plain and old sticks to the historical evidence. They don't even bother with the natural theology. They'll say, oh, okay, as long as we get the evidential stuff done, they'll hook them onto the naturalistic stuff. So a good example is William Lane Craig, R.C. Sproul, Thomas Aquinas, to go for someone older. These would be examples of classical apologetics, while an example of an evidentialist would be someone like Gary Habermas, who sticks purely to the historical stuff.
Right, very good. We have a new person that joined us, Chuck Wagon. Chuck Wagon is a friend of mine. We've known each other for quite a few years. He's a Southern Baptist pastor. So that's an interesting perspective conversation. Chuck, would you like to add anything into the conversation?
Oh, is it? I don't know if I'm muted.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, you can. Okay. Not much. I'm not a presuppositionalist myself. I believe more in evidentialism and the use of logic and philosophy. But thank you for the opportunity, and I'm just going to be sitting here learning a lot.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. With that in mind, I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add anything else. I think might be able to wrap it up.
Well, I'd like to add in that well, it's not entirely novel. I've seen it, prior use of it documented, but there is an argument from logic against the precondition for intelligibility of Aristotelian logic that I like to favor because, of course, you know, some minor study in that, and I mean, essentially, what I try to establish is that I can have an intelligible worldview and so on, or so to speak, with an alternative logic like fuzzy logic or probabilistic logic, and it isn't all that hard. And probably one of the other kinks I throw in it, just because it shuts down some of the regress, is making it also predicative, so that self-reference and so on is disallowed. One of the fun parts is that the law of the excluded middle doesn't exactly hold. Fuzzy logics are not bivalent. They don't have two truth values. They have generally a spectrum, like a real number between 0 and 1. And so what you get when you say negate a proposition, its truth value is 1 minus that. And when you say take the conjunction of two propositions, you take the minimum of the truth values. So when you try to form, you know, A and not A, you end up with if the truth value of A is C or X or something, then it's the minimum of X and 1 minus X, right? So which is not necessarily false unless A is certainly true, right? So, and you can actually operate on this and do pretty well. I tend to respond to, you know, how do I know that when I say my degree of confidence in something is C or 90% or whatever, is that I'm certain of that as I am of my own evaluations of my degrees of confidence and such, and that's pretty much well, stops the regress of something that's self-evident and so on. So go ahead.
I was just going to say a tricky part with using not just what you're proposing, but any system presuppositionalist isn't used to, is usually meant, of course, this can go with any of the criticisms you bring up, but they're more prone to be met with incredulity. For example, in my discussion with Arcane Logos, I brought up that I don't hold that knowledge is true justified belief. I think a knowledge is coherent and justifiable belief, to which he said, oh, that's relativism. If I say you have a mohawk, and I say, no, I don't have a mohawk, then how do you, I'm saying, well, I kept trying to insist that my belief that I had a mohawk, I did not have a mohawk, my bad, was far more coherent and justifiable, all things considered, where, as he just kept insisting on relativism. However, with rejecting law of the extreme middle, I suppose you would, I think you just brought this one up yourself, you'd be met with the same kind of incredulity where they'd say, oh, really, can that be true or not true? Something like that. Is that true in all circumstances? They're going to try to push or contest that you're still relying on that law of excluded middle when you're denying the law of excluded middle. That sort of thing.
Right. They do, and I managed to stay consistent enough to aggravate them and just yell back at me or something that, well, you don't know anything for certain, so I refuse to talk to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish up, Nadia.
One thing actually, that's part of why throwing predicativity into the mix, where all the implicit and explicit self-references are disallowed, is somewhat helpful, because it actually shuts down the line of questioning with you're asking an formal question. So once that tends to have them hunting and skipping around for a long enough sequence of questions for long enough to embarrass themselves more. So now, granted, as far as demonstrations go, the full demonstration that I have some kind of coherent worldview with all this, intelligible, whatever their preconditions for intelligibility are when they fall back on the tag. That I don't actually get to articulate fully in general, but as a logic that's consistent and so on, it works like the rest of them that are too. I mean, any of them will work. It's just one that's a counterexample that I've used in practice and at least had that much success getting them to make that concession. So.
Yeah, it kind of leads to how they account for logic. Often a question they'll ask you is, how do you account for the immaterial, unchanging laws of logic in a material, ever-changing universe, and the way they account for logic is to say that logic reflects the nature of God, and God is logical and rational. But they're kind of saying that is God only limited to the classical logic? God is limited to only thinking of the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction and the law of undistributed middle and so forth, and that's all God is. That's all His nature is just limited. Is just logical in the classical sense, and then the other forms of logic aren't part of His nature. So it seems to be a little short-sighted there, and it also seems to be a form of equivocation as well. Arguments, syllogisms are logical. Natures aren't logical. I mean, I guess you could say a nature is an identity, but just to say some being's nature is logical, it seems to be an equivocation.
Yeah, but here's the one interesting thing.
It gets worse, actually. Oh.
Go on, Nadia. I've spoken up here.
I was going to say it gets even worse because there are logics that are very similar to classical. Well, okay, strictly speaking, Hating arithmetic is intuitionistic, but there is Martin Lorentz type theory, and in that the axiom of choice is decidedly false, and in say new foundations, axiom of choice is a theorem, right? So, which logic does God pick? Who knows? They both line up with classical. Their descriptions of classical logic are actually too vague or not fully specified enough to narrow it down between those two, right? So it's pretty far out.
The interesting thing is we're still stuck on trying to it's a still contested issue in philosophy, not necessarily which logic is correct or most correct or reflects the world the best, but what is the ontological status of logic? Is it just a very helpful fiction we come up with, or is it platonic in nature? It has its kind of own existence, simple to mathematical numbers. And there's pretty much a whole various positions one can even take on that.
Yeah, and you know, to say, you know, logic reflects the nature of God. Well, you know, how exactly? And you know, to say, well, God is logical, that kind of assumes all logical, you know, logic already exists and so forth. So it's, you know, it is question begging just to make that claim. Gene Witt.
Yeah, Euthyphro, with respect to logic, right? So,
Yeah.
is it logical because it's God's nature, or is it God's nature because it's logical?
There's when one studies these three laws of classical logic come from it's Aristotelian past, and logic has even classical logic. I mean, and classical logic even has changed since then. But all classical logical systems still tend to underlie the law of identity, the law of exclusion, the law of non-contradiction, this sort of thing, and it doesn't apply just to God. Aristotle's system was to show that these are a pretense not just to God being logical or intelligible, but anything being logical or intelligible. It's not just because God is intelligible that whatever He creates is intelligible. It's that being itself. Well, it's just that being is itself intelligible, or any kind.
But I've had that from both directions, right? I had a system that defies classical logic, or multiple systems that defy classical logic that are plenty intelligible, and then I had two distinct systems that both you know, meet the descriptions of classical logic that contradict each other, right? So they're in quite a bit of trouble when they try to hold up the rather vague descriptions of classical logic they use.
Well, I guess one can always say that non-classical logics are just very helpful, or very helpful fictions, while they themselves have to presume that a classical logical system is true. Just off the top of my head, coming up with sense here.
Well, the two that contradict each other or actually several, contradict each other with respect to the axiom of choice, actually are actually both count as classical.
Are they? Does it deal with the liar's paradox or something? I know there are interesting thought experiments that help tackle this. Liar's paradox being one of them. The other one is when you remove each grain of sand off a pile until you get until you try to discover when exactly you used the pile. This kind of thing. We're talking about a specific thought experiment, or are we talking about two classical systems that come to different results?
There are multiple classical systems that get mutually contradictory results, right? So they qualify as classical because, like, the description of what a classical logic, Aristotelian logic is actually not quite detailed enough to fully flesh out things for, say, mathematics, right? So you actually have to add a few more axioms, and then before you can really start working. And which axioms you add beyond that are what the difference is between, say, you know, Martin Lorentz type theory and new foundations, and several Frankel choice and so on.
I guess you could always argue that something along the lines of Quine's two empiricisms, where you could say logic, which is an abstract system, or is just like any synthetic system. We discover more about it as we put it in practice and learn about it and even apply it. So even though we might not know the answer to this, as it would be a puzzle, it wouldn't preclude that without more evidence and practice that we wouldn't know more about it in the future.
Yeah, there's, well, you know, an entire like theory of mathematical logic. So,
Yeah,
you know, in these, sorry.
It's quite an interesting thing to discuss, but a presuppositionalist, just to bring it back to our main discussion, doesn't really appreciate even this side of the fence, that logic is something that's purely guaranteed to the thinker, which it isn't. Even logicians have to defend their system, and logicians also have to account for a lot of things in their own systems as well. It's not just a given.
Well, actually, I don't believe that the logicians attempt to justify their systems. I think what they do is that they, you know, examine, you know, differing systems and try to characterize their behaviors in interesting ways. So you'll have things like, you know, soundness and compactness of elements and.
Am I conflating the logician with the philosopher of logic, or are they both? You're probably confronting a naive, ham-handed philosopher with a logician's logic. No, fair enough.
Only I'm not a real, I'm not a real logician, but I've had a superficial like survey of it. So.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I read a paper by philosopher Gene Whitmer about presuppositionalism, and he talks about you know, their account for logic, and he brings up the analogy of sleeping pills. If someone asks you how do sleeping pills make you tired, make you sleepy, and you responded, well, because of their dormitive nature. You know, in other words, sleeping pills put you to sleep because they put you to sleep. It really doesn't add anything. It doesn't give you any. It's not a real explanation. It doesn't add any new information of you know, how it makes you tired. You know, it just simply says, you know, sleeping pills put you to sleep because of their dormitive nature, because of their sleep-inducing nature. You know, it really adds nothing. And you could say the same thing about fire. Why is fire hot? Well, fire is hot because of its heat-emitting nature. Again, all you're saying is fire is hot because fire is hot. You know, a better explanation would be because, well, there's a chemical breakdown and it releases energy, and that energy hits our skin, and which reacts to our nerve endings and so forth, and we feel pain. We feel the heat. You know, that would be a better explanation, because you're adding in new information, where just saying it reflects some nature, and its nature is what you're trying to account for. Is, you know, it doesn't add any information, and it's circular. It's question begging.
There's another way to put that. When people say that they're going to account for something like logic in terms of God, what needs to be done there is say, well, okay, well, first of all, what needs accounting for? What are the problems associated with the mere existence of logic that need to be accounted for, and how does positing a God explain those things? But then, when they say that, well, God is just not logical in his very nature, as you say, they're not providing you with anything. To say that God is logical is to predicate logic of God. Right? If I say God is logical, I'm not saying anything about logic. I'm saying something about God. I'm saying that God is logical. It's you know, I've told you something about the nature of God when I tell you that he's logical. But if the whole point is to give an account of logic, well, I'm sorry, but the direction of explanation is going the wrong way. When you say God is logical, you're telling me nothing about logic. You're not accounting for logic. You've just fleshed out your concept of God. And to the extent that I already understand logic, okay, now I understand something about God. But if the whole point is to give an account of logic, you have not done that. The same is true of the moral argument, when people say that God is, by his very nature, moral. And as part of the account of morality, you're not actually accounting for morality that way. You're telling me something about God, that namely that he is moral, to the extent that I already have some understanding of the concept of morality. But you're not telling me anything about morality when you predicate morality of God. So predicating, something like is logical, or is moral, or is crispy, or is chocolatey, of anything, okay, including God, doesn't tell you anything about the thing that you're predicating, right? Logical, morality, chocolatey, crispy, whatever. What you're telling me is something about God on the assumption that I already understand the concept that you're predicating of God. And so the direction of explanation is exactly backwards, and as you said, it's a vacuous explanation. It explains nothing, adds nothing to the account. It is not an account. That is a completely degenerate conception of what it means to account for something.
I can account for chocolatey or for chocolate on my own very much. Thank. It got weirdly quiet.
Yeah. Okay, I invite more people. I guess one thing I want to stress, and we stated at the beginning of the hangout, is the idea of presuppositions and properly basic beliefs. And it seems like this cyclone method of presupposition is to simply attack what's considered in philosophy to be properly basic beliefs, where philosophers, presuppositionalists like Greg Bahnsen have already acknowledged, and people like Tsai have already acknowledged, are not able. You're not able to justify them. They are taken on faith, so to speak. To justify them, it would only lead to circular reasoning, and they're foundational, and they're the stepping stones for reason, for knowledge, and so forth. So it's simply hypocritical and a double standard to simply attack another worldview's presuppositions when you yourself accept that your own presuppositions cannot be justified. It's hypocritical, and we heard from Tsai and other cyclones, the concept that it's virtuously circular, where our justification for them would only be viciously circular, which is absurd. There is no such thing as virtuously circular.
They're in effect creating their own logical system, where there's circular reasoning is vicious, except in one instance.
Yeah, it's special pleading. Yeah, special pleading. Where it's been stated to them a number of times, we're all in the same epistemic boat. We're all fallible human beings. We all obtain knowledge from our own single point of in time and space, from our own limited perspective. And that's just a condition of humans, and I think it's part of our. I think there's a need, a desire for humans to be all-knowing. It seems like there's a desire for humans to be God, to be all-knowing, and so forth. Part of Christian theology is, the sin of Adam and Eve is they wanting to be gods, and here presuppositionalists want to be certain, want to have certain knowledge that they cannot be wrong, and it always seems like they want to be God. So I guess, could that be considered a sin in itself? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. Could any Christians here, religious? Does that make sense at all? What I'm suggesting? For the desire to be absolutely certain about something, because there's a part of you where you should have strong faith and never doubt God, but there's also another side which says you want to have absolute certainty about your own cognitive abilities. Is there a conflict there? I don't know. It's something to think about.
I had a thought on the issue of certainty, because the cyclones really go on about certainty an awful lot. They seem to imagine that certainty is a condition on knowledge. Now, the reason they think that is because they naively subscribe to an internalist conception of justification, not realizing that externalism is the conception of justification operative in presuppositionalism. And they naively assume the KK principle, that in order to know something, you have to know that you know it, that you know it. But I mean, in epistemology, certainty is considered an epistemological desideratum, not a necessitatum. It's a desirable thing, not a necessary thing. But even presuppositionalists, real presuppositionalists, understood that God can confer knowledge to people, can make possible knowledge for people, can make it possible that there be knowledge for us, without having us be certain about it. Right? That's the kind of ordinary, mundane knowledge we have around us all the time. Certainty is not required for that. Right? Now, the argument that people like Bahnsen made and Cornelius Van Til was that we can't be certain, we can't have certainty, but certainty isn't required for knowledge. But it is a desideratum. It's a desirable thing, even if it's not necessary for knowledge. It's desirable, and only a God could make knowledge certain, because only a God could be certain, and only a God could confer knowledge of which you could be certain. And so, they believe that through the testimony, the self-authenticating character of the witness of the Holy Spirit, a Christian could be certain, enjoy the full conviction of their faith, because this was delivered to them by the Holy Spirit, and so they could be certain about it. But they didn't claim to be certain about everything else going around them in the world, and certainty wasn't required for that. Certainty is not a condition on knowledge, according to presuppositionalism. It's only a condition on knowledge according to the cyclones, it seems. The view was that certainty is something that only God could provide, but you didn't have to have God provide that certainty for you to have knowledge. And so they seem to have confused these two things, and it's in part, I think, because the aim of this particular script is to stump people with a bunch of how do you know that style questions. And then when, as soon as a person admits that they're not certain, they say, you're not certain, therefore you don't know. But that is a very weird thing. It's a very weird idea.
But that's what they want. I think the whole point of this cyclone movement is just to find an excuse to have the certainty they've probably always wanted. Because using really the traditional methods of philosophy, they could never really get there. So it just seems more that if you proclaim what you want, and that you proclaim that you actually have it, and you say it so strongly with such stern confidence that you would probably make people believe you, I think then they can essentially run the script. The only way their script really works is if the person presenting it is just so snarky and so confident in his own words that he can actually make it to the point where he can make other people believe that he's confident in what he believes.
Well, I mean that might be true, sort of as a psychological fact about what motivates a person to favor this particular apologetic, the cyclone version. But what I was making a slightly different point, and it's not that I don't it's not that I don't agree. In fact, I do agree with what you said there. That I think that the motivations you described are in fact operative, but that's not really a good objection if you're talking to them, and I don't think it helps us understand the difference between presuppositionalism properly understood, and this kind of cyclone version that is, I think, a really debauched version where it's basically presuppositionalism without having understood any of the relevant epistemological concerns and concepts. And so there's just this borrowed jargon, and they've sort of confected an epistemology. It's a bit of a mess, and it's sort of a, I mean, I've talked to presuppositionalists who are completely embarrassed by this. You know, they're saying this is not presuppositionalism, this is an embarrassing kind of tactic at kind of, you know, poning people and humiliating people by pointing out what anyone in the first-year philosophy course knows, which is that it's very hard to justify your beliefs, and that a justificatory regress is very, very easy to demonstrate. It takes about 5 minutes. You don't have to sort of make a career out of it. But the larger issue for me is that somehow people have convinced themselves, who subscribe to this apologetic, the cyclone version specifically, they've convinced themselves that certainty is a condition on knowledge. And these same people, when you ask them to define knowledge, will tell you that knowledge is justified true belief, as if, first of all, that is the definition. But, like, where is certainty in this definition? It's not in there, right? They smuggled this in. And so it's kind of odd. They don't realize that their own definition of knowledge says it's a justified true belief, not a certainly justified true belief, or a justified true belief plus certainty. You know, I mean, certainty just is not a condition on knowledge according to most epistemologists, and it's certainly not a condition on knowledge for even presuppositionalists. It's just that certainty is something that can only be had if there's a God, but it's not necessary to have knowledge. And that I mean, it's sort of so weird to me that these people have staked so much on the concept of certainty, given that certainty really is just a measure of your confidence, and there's all this equivocation that goes on between certitude, something being a fact, and certainty, which is a degree of conviction. And so as soon as a person admits that they don't have a very strong conviction, right, that they have some doubt, that this implies that what they believe is not a certitude, right? And this is a complete equivocation, and it's born of not actually having studied any of the relevant philosophy. And I mean, this is a philosophical apologetic. You know, you really owe it to yourself, if you are a presuppositionalist, to go to university and take some of the relevant courses and stop learning your philosophy through apologetics websites.
Well, Ozzy,
I'd also like to. I'd also like to throw in there, if I could suggest a presuppositionalist that if you have to go to presuppositionalism to go to, the presuppositionalist I most respect is John Frame, I would say. Because he actually does not, he also incorporates classical arguments, and he has a fairly well defended position, at least as far as I've seen it.
Well, I mean, I've done hangouts where I have, well, Epi, you were there. I mean, where we talked about, you know, Bonson and Cornelius Van Til and stuff like that. It's not like sort of I'm an enemy of these philosophical ideas. I happen to think that these are not satisfactory apologetics, but they're not sort of, you know, embarrassing.
No, I know. I'm just kidding. Who is interested? Not necessarily that I have this huge. There are presuppositionalists I myself respect too. Frame just being one of them.
Yeah, it seems like from the cyclones, you know, they use, you know, justified true belief, and the way they define justified is to be certain. And what does it mean to be certain? That there's no possible way that the belief can be false. Well, if a belief is true, there's no possible way it can be false, right?
Right.
So the fact that they're defining knowledge as true belief. Now, if they say there's no way that I can be wrong about that, well, again, if the belief is true, there's no way that you can be wrong about that, right? So again, to say that certainty means there's no way you can be true, there's no way you can be false, it's simply saying that you have a true belief. So how is that justification? you're defining as true belief. I mean, that's how I interpret that.
No, that's exactly right. They seem to forget that the truth condition on knowledge means that when you have knowledge, the truth condition has been satisfied. But what they want is justification to include what's called a verification procedure. Okay. Now, a verification procedure can be a part of justification. A verification procedure is how do you verify that your belief is true? Okay. But justification is not just verification. Okay. You can be justified in having a belief if you're, according to externalism, you can be justified in having a belief if your belief is caused by or occasioned by the facts in the right way through a reliable process, even though you don't know how your brain works, you don't know how optics works, and so you don't know, the mechanics of how the visual experience you're having is delivered to you. But so if I'm looking at a cup and I have a visual experience of a cup, and that visual experience is caused by the cup, then I am objectively justified. I have an externalist, I've satisfied the externalist condition on justification. What I haven't given, though, is a verification procedure on how I can establish that everything is in working order and that causal story is true. I don't have a way of doing that. And that's true. And a person might say, well, don't you need that? Well, actually, you don't. There are pragmatic reasons why you want that, but there's no reason why that has to be a condition of knowledge, for something to be a case of knowledge. But I mean, what verification procedures do they have? Right? What verification procedures has a presuppositionalist ever given you for what they believe? Well, they don't have any. They have the verification procedures that all of us have. They have science, and they have reasoning, and they have logic, and they have the quest for internal consistency and external consistency and induction and all of the rest of it. Right? But they don't have. It's not like they have some other verification procedure to establish their beliefs over and above what the rest of us have. They don't have that. What they're positing is that there is something outside of them, external to them, that serves as the guarantor of the veracity of their beliefs. But merely positing that such a thing exists is not the same thing as providing a verification procedure that it exists. And so they're just positing this. They're simply positing that there exists something that has certain stipulated attributes, which, if it exists, would make knowledge possible. Great. We all do that. We all posit a mind-independent reality, and that we have evolved brains, and that we have sensory systems and cognitive apparatuses that systematically co-vary with changing circumstances, such that our beliefs are, under ordinary circumstances, reliably occasioned or caused by what's actually happening around us. Okay? I can posit all of that too. That's not any more metaphysically extravagant than what they're positing. In fact, it posits one less thing, God, and it all works. So if they're allowed to posit something and stipulate that it has certain properties without a verification procedure, then so is anybody else. And if they don't, then they are again playing by yet another double standard, which seems to be the theme of this particular hangout.
Right.
This certainty of the necessary justification it is raised almost immediately by the non-standard logics like probabilistic and fuzzy, and it would probably be useful to deploy this line of argument in tandem with those.
Well, the thing that this brings up to me, at least the question that I tend to have, is that it calls into question, after this has been run through the ringer so many times and so many, I guess, good arguments have countered the psi version of this, can we still believe that people like psi honestly believe what they're saying, or as what he's said on tape, it's just a method to shut the atheists up? That's what it seems like it's starting to boil down to me. It's not that they actually believe what they're saying. It's just, this is a gotcha argument that you can't do anything except run in circles with until you get tired and either lose control or quit.
I want to counter that with a little bit of the way in which you have an authority figure telling you something. If you believe strong enough that an authority is telling you what is correct, and for instance, you go to Saitan, and Saitan himself may not. He may have figured it. There's several atheist preachers and stuff like that. That happens. That occurs. I'll accept that as a possibility. But with an authority figure, you believe that they're telling you, and you believe in God, and you believe that the authority is telling you from God that this methodology is true, then you cannot, because you believe that this authority wouldn't lie to you, but you also believe that everything it says is correct. Therefore, you stick with those guns 100% for that reason. It must be true because my authority is telling me so.
Yeah, well, I think that's where they say presuppositionalism is more biblical because it does not doubt God. It does not doubt Scripture. It holds that Scripture, you hold that Scripture is absolutely correct, that you have absolute faith in God, and you should not question that at all. That to question any of that is a sin, and therefore is unbiblical. You must stick to that and hold on to it no matter what, because if you have any doubt, if you doubt God, if you doubt the Scripture, that is a sin. That is the autonomy of the self. And therefore, it's unbiblical and it's a sin, and it should not be done at all. Sai in one of his lectures actually said, he just said, just whatever's in the Bible, you believe it, and that's all that's needed. Whatever it says in the Bible, you just believe it, and that's all that needs. And he says that's what I wish, that all that has to be said, and that is it. Don't doubt it at all. And that's as far as you go. So I think that's where a strong, their strong motivation and what their mantra is behind all this.
Mm-hmm. Now the mentality stated forth. It doesn't matter if it's religious or not. It doesn't. It doesn't matter if there's a God figure behind it. That mentality is dangerous, in and of itself, on the basis that especially if you believe that the authority figure communicates to you inside your mind, because it'll agree with you. Your internal authority figure will agree with you because it's internally consistent with your own mind frame. So you can justify any action and say, well, it's justified because my authority figure agrees with these actions. And if you self-delude yourself into thinking there's not a separation at all, and that this authority figure is 100% correct, and that there's, as long as my authority figure is agreeing with me and I can do anything, it's scary as to what someone's not willing to do when you look at that mind frame. The test I'll refer to, the experiment I'll refer to, is the electrocution experiment, where they could hear people being electrocuted, and because the authority figure told them to do it, they did it.
Okay. It's been almost 2 hours now. I guess I'll wrap up the on-air broadcast. Does anyone else have anything else to say before I go off air? All right. Well, thanks for everyone for joining, and thanks for an interesting conversation. Bye all.